Most leaders operate on assumptions that they've dressed up to look like a strategy. They point to an org chart, a stack of policies, and a few compliance frameworks, assuming these documents represent how the business actually functions. They are wrong. The space between what you think your company does and what it actually does is where risk lives, but it's also where you'll find your biggest opportunities and a massive amount of wasted money. This is the uncomfortable reality that Microsoft Purview reveals, provided you actually know how to look at the data it provides. Most people treat Purview as a basic compliance tool or a simple checkbox to satisfy auditors and avoid regulatory fines. They think the goal is just ticking boxes on a dashboard, running a few policies to block an occasional email, and generating reports to prove they aren't breaking GDPR rules. That is not what Purview is for. Purview is a diagnostic platform and an operating system for understanding the mechanics of your business. It shows you where data actually flows and where decisions really happen in real time, highlighting exactly where your corporate assumptions collide with reality. As we move into 2026, you'll be deploying Copilot at scale and building AI agents to handle complex workflows, which means your competitive advantage depends entirely on how fast you can move safely. In this environment, Purview becomes the lens you use to see if your infrastructure is actually ready for that speed. Here is the plan for this episode. We are going to reframe Purview from a defensive protection mechanism into a high-level business intelligence tool. I'll show you how sensitivity labels reveal what your organization truly values and how DLP violations point to the exact spots where your official workflows are broken. We will look at how insider risk signals usually indicate organizational stress rather than actual malice, creating a diagnostic picture of the real company operating underneath your formal org chart. By the end of this discussion, you'll understand why Purview isn't just something you implement to stay compliant. It's a system you use because it exposes the critical details you didn't even know you were missing. Let's start with the core problem. Your company has an org chart where sales reports to a VP, finance reports to the CFO, and operations answers to the COO. There is a clear structure with accountability and reporting lines, yet that chart is almost completely useless for understanding how work actually gets done. Work follows the data and the path of least resistance, not the lines on a PDF. In most organizations, the path of least resistance looks nothing like the official process your leadership team signed off on. If you ask your CFO where customer data lives, they'll give you one answer, but the VP of sales will give you a different one. If you find the person actually responsible for maintaining that data, their answer will be different still. And none of those answers will be complete because they all involve a level of guessing. This isn't a sign of incompetence, but rather the natural state of companies that have grown much faster than their governance infrastructure. The org chart doesn't account for actual decision-making nodes, nor does it show you where information bottlenecks form or which small team is holding up 3 major workflows. We call this the illusion of control. That you think you know how the business operates because you have roles and reporting structures, but you're actually operating on a theoretical model while the real model is messier and more fragile. Purview is the tool that breaks that illusion. When you scan your SharePoint tenant or apply sensitivity labels, you aren't just gathering compliance artifacts for a report. You are collecting diagnostic data about the real organization, using labels to see what people actually value, and DLP violations to see where policy friction creates workarounds. Taken together, this data tells the story of how your business really functions. And here's the critical part. That story is almost never the same as the one told by your org chart. Most organizations have massive discovery gaps where they don't fully know where their sensitive data is hiding. You might know the obvious spots like your CRM or financial systems, but you likely don't know about the spreadsheets finance keeps in a private OneDrive or the customer list sales stored in a random Teams folder. You don't have a data reality right now, you only have a collection of guesses. When you ask where your most critical data lives, the polite answer is in our systems of record, but the honest answer is usually everywhere, and we aren't sure it's all protected. Purview solves this, not by locking everything down behind a wall, but by making the invisible parts of your business visible. Let me give you a concrete example of this in action. I recently looked at a financial services firm that had a Purview implementation and a solid information protection strategy on paper. They had a clear classification scheme for internal and confidential files, and their DLP rules were active, meaning they were technically compliant by every standard metric. But when they actually looked at the data distribution after running Purview scans, they realized that 85% of their labeled data was marked as confidential or highly confidential. If nearly everything is classified as highly sensitive, then nothing is actually sensitive and the entire system just becomes background noise. In another organization, they found the opposite problem where clinical notes that should have been locked down were almost entirely unlabeled. The system had failed because nobody was actually using it or validating it. This is what Purview reveals when you know how to read the signals, the massive gap between what your policy intended and what is actually happening on the ground. And that gap is exactly where your risk lives. This matters more than ever in 2026 because Microsoft 365 Copilot is rolling out and custom AI agents are being built. You are likely planning to give AI access to your data so it can run processes and handle decisions, but Copilot respects the permissions and labels you already have in place. If your data is scattered across 17 systems with inconsistent labels, Copilot will simply reflect that same chaos back to you. If you haven't governed your data, you cannot safely govern how an AI accesses that data. This is the moment where Purview stops being a boring compliance task and starts being a requirement for competitive readiness. The organizations that win this year won't be the ones with perfect governance, but the ones that see their own structure clearly. They understand their risks, they know what data matters, and they've made intentional decisions about what to protect and what to expose. Purview is the tool that makes that vision possible. Over the next hour, we're going to walk through this together. In part 1, we'll examine the illusion of control and why your org chart doesn't match your data flows. We will explore the 3 critical failures of traditional governance and introduce the 3 questions every organization must be able to answer about its data. In part 2, we shift from theory to practice to show you how sensitivity labels work as a map of organizational priorities. We'll look at why DLP violations show broken workflows rather than reckless people and reframe insider risk as a stress indicator. In part 3, we'll position Purview as an X-ray machine for visibility. I'll show you how to identify silos and visualize true dependencies that your org chart will never tell you about. In part 4, we move from diagnosis to action with 3 specific audits you can run right now. These aren't theoretical exercises. They are the foundation for actually seeing your business for what it is. Finally, in part 5, we'll connect all of this to AI readiness. AI doesn't fail because the technology is bad. It fails because the data is a mess, making readiness a governance problem rather than a technical one. Throughout this, we'll use real examples like a sales team that bypasses a slow CRM or a finance team wasting weeks on manual reconciliation. These aren't rare edge cases, they are the default state for most companies. By the end of this, you'll see that Purview isn't just a tool for compliance, it's the only way to actually see your organization. In an era of AI and high-speed data, seeing clearly isn't just a nice feature to have, it's existential. Let's get started. The confidence trap, why leaders don't see the gap. You are operating on assumptions every single day, and while it isn't intentional, it is happening systematically. Your CFO makes decisions about data protection based on what they think is sensitive, while the VP of sales structures the pipeline based on what they believe the numbers look like. At the same time, the IT team configures access controls based on assumptions about roles, and the compliance officer designs policies based on what they assume the organization is doing. None of these people are lying to you, and they certainly aren't incompetent. They are simply working with incomplete information, and the system they work in keeps reinforcing the idea that their information is complete. This is the confidence trap. It works like this. You have a policy stating all customer data must be labeled confidential, and because that policy exists, you believe people are following it. You've created a mental model where your data is protected because you communicated the rule, but the actual labeling is where that model usually falls apart. In most organizations, only about 30 to 50% of sensitive data is actually labeled, leaving the rest to exist in the gap between your intent and the operational reality. People aren't trying to violate the rules. It's just that the policy doesn't fit their workflow or the labeling tool is too inconvenient to use. You don't see this gap because you aren't measuring it. You see the policy and the training sessions, which is just compliance theater, but you don't see the actual flow of data. The uncomfortable truth is that your org chart and your data flow chart represent 2 completely different organizations. The org chart says sales reports to the VP, but the data flow might show that their decisions are actually driven by a spreadsheet owned by a junior analyst in operations. The official process says to use the CRM, but the actual process bypasses it because the software is too slow or doesn't have the right fields. Your chart says finance owns the customer master data, but the reality is that the data lives in 3 different places with nobody truly owning it. Versions diverge, they never reconcile, and the Chief Information Security Officer's protection strategy ends up depending on whether a single team member remembered to click a button. Protection becomes a matter of probability instead of a certainty. You are left hoping the system works instead of knowing it works. Because you can't see the actual data flow, you stay confident and assume the policy is being followed. This confidence is dangerous because it blinds you to risk and prevents you from understanding what is actually valuable in your company. When you try to deploy Copilot, you'll end up giving it access to data you think is classified but isn't, and you'll assume the AI can operate safely in an environment that is actually quite fragile. This trap persists because the chain of command is too long and the system is too distributed for clear communication to survive. When a policy is created at the top and passed down, every layer of management interprets it differently based on their own constraints. By the time it reaches the person actually doing the work, the original intent has been filtered through 5 layers of organizational assumption. You believe the system is working because you can point to a document or a training log, but policies naturally drift over time. Work rarely conforms to the official process because the official process is usually less efficient than the workarounds people have developed for themselves. The finance team keeps a local spreadsheet because it's faster than waiting for an official report, and the sales team stores deals in a private folder because the CRM is missing key fields. These are rational decisions made by people trying to solve real problems, but they create parallel data flows where ownership becomes a blur. You won't see any of this if you aren't looking at the actual data. This is where Purview changes the picture. It doesn't just force compliance, it makes the invisible visible so you can see what is actually happening instead of what you assume is happening. The three failures of traditional governance. Traditional governance frameworks almost always fail in three specific ways, starting with a total breakdown in communication. Policies are abstract by nature, but their application is concrete, and the gap between those two things is where confusion lives. You might create a clear policy for customer data, but does that include just the name, or does it cover account numbers, contact history, and invoice logs as well? What seems obvious to the person writing the policy is often ambiguous to the person implementing it, leading to an inconsistent system where everyone labels things differently. Communication also fails because you usually only talk about the policy once during a training session. People nod and listen, but then they go back to a desk where 15 other things are competing for their attention, and the policy quickly becomes an afterthought. 6 months later, most of the team hasn't thought about that training once, and new hires have missed it entirely. The policy still exists on paper, but the actual operation has drifted far away from the original intent. The second failure is one of enforcement. You simply cannot enforce what you cannot see. Most organizations only have visibility into about 30% of their data, while the rest is shadow data living in unmonitored systems or local spreadsheets. Shadow data isn't a secret, but it is invisible to your governance system, which means you can't label it, protect it, or control it. Because it exists outside your perimeter, it becomes the path of least resistance for employees who find the official systems too restrictive. This creates a feedback loop where more enforcement in the official system drives more people toward shadow systems. The more they move away, the less you can enforce, and eventually people stop believing the system matters at all. The third failure is relevance. Static policies in a fast-moving business environment eventually become friction for their own sake. A policy might have made sense 2 years ago, but as new products launch and markets change, the old rules don't evolve with the business. When policies become irrelevant, people stop seeing them as governance and start seeing them as obstacles to be avoided. We see this constantly with DLP policies that block credit card numbers. If a vendor needs a transaction list that happens to have one card number in a column, the policy blocks the email, and the team immediately finds a workaround. They'll send it through a non-monitored channel or copy it into a different file type just to get the job done. The policy was well-intentioned, but because it didn't account for the actual business need, it created the very friction that led to the workaround. These three failures, communication, enforcement, and relevance, compound over time. They create an environment where policies exist but don't reflect reality, and where enforcement is attempted but doesn't actually cover the data flow. You are blind to all of this unless you are looking at the actual data. The three questions that unlock clarity. To change this, you need a framework built on three specific questions. If you can answer these with confidence, you understand your organization, but if you can't, you have dangerous gaps in your strategy. Question 1. Do we know where our critical data is? I'm not asking if you think you know, I'm asking if you actually know across every system you own. Where are the financial records, the intellectual property, and the strategic plans hiding? Most organizations can only point to the obvious places like the CRM or the main document repository. They have no idea about the spreadsheets in shadow systems or the files sitting in random Teams folders and cloud storage outside the official infrastructure. When you can answer this question completely, you have finally solved the discovery problem. Question 2. Do our policies reflect reality or just intention? Is your labeling policy actually being followed on a daily basis, and are those labels even correct? You need to know if your DLP policy is actually blocking what you think it is, or if your employees are just finding clever ways around it. The only way to answer this is by measuring the data. You have to run a scan and compare the actual data against your policy intent to see where the gaps are. That gap is your new priority because that is where your risk lives. Question 3. Are we managing behavior or assuming it? Are you actively measuring who is accessing your data, or are you just hoping everything is fine because you have a policy in place? Active measurement means you can see patterns, detect anomalies, and notice when someone accesses data outside their normal role. Assumption is the belief that the system is working simply because you haven't seen evidence that it's failing yet. These three questions form the data reality check framework, forcing you to move away from belief and toward actual measurement. When you answer these questions with real data, you stop operating on hope and start operating on facts. Your organization becomes legible, and while it won't be perfect, it will finally be visible. Visibility is exactly where real change starts. What your data actually reveals. Now that we've established the framework, those three core questions, We need to look at what the data is actually screaming at you when you open the hood. Microsoft Purview generally hands you three primary signals: sensitivity labels, DLP violations, and insider risk indicators. Most leadership teams treat these as boring security artifacts or compliance objects that belong in a quarterly report. But they aren't just checkboxes. They are behavioral data points that map out how your organization actually thinks about information and where the structure is currently under life-threatening stress. When you learn how to read these signals, Purview stops being a security tool and becomes a diagnostic lens for your entire business reality. Sensitivity labels as a map of business criticality. Here is the uncomfortable truth about sensitivity labels. They don't actually measure how sensitive your data is. Instead, they measure how your people perceive value and risk, which is a very different thing. This distinction matters because the theory of data classification is always much cleaner than the reality. In a perfect world, you define categories like internal, confidential, and highly confidential, then everyone applies them perfectly so that data flows securely. In practice, labels are a mirror of organizational anxiety and cultural confusion. If you scan your environment and find that 85% of your files are marked highly confidential, it doesn't mean you're the most secretive company on earth. It means your team doesn't actually know what matters, so they've decided that everything is important, which effectively means nothing is. The label has lost all signal value and turned into pure noise. Compare that to a healthy distribution where you see a graduated scale of public, internal, and restricted data. That spread tells me the organization has made intentional decisions about what truly carries value. The difference isn't the data itself, it's the level of clarity the leadership has provided about what the company actually protects. When a finance team overclassifies every routine spreadsheet as highly confidential, they aren't being extra cautious. They are admitting they can't differentiate between a critical fiscal secret and a standard report, so they lock everything behind the same heavy door. This creates massive operational friction because you can't optimize permissions or move quickly when every single file requires the highest level of clearance. The labeling data is revealing your maturity in decision-making rather than your strength in security. We also see the opposite pattern, massive amounts of sensitive clinical or financial data with no labels at all. This is a sign that the organization has essentially given up and the labeling system has become so invisible or difficult that people just ignore it. This is governance theater where the actors have stopped showing up for rehearsals. When you look at these distributions in Purview, you are looking at a behavioral map of what your organization actually prioritizes versus what it claims to protect in a policy manual. These patterns also tell you exactly where change will be the hardest. Teams with consistent, accurate labeling have already built the operational muscle to handle data with care, and they will adapt quickly when you introduce new AI tools or workflows. Teams that haven't labeled a single document have no such muscle, and they will require a complete shift in mindset before they can safely use modern automation. This is why labeling isn't just a compliance report. It's a high-level organizational diagnostic. DLP violations as windows into broken processes. Data loss prevention violations are almost never security events. In my experience, they are almost always indicators of process friction, where the official way of working has become a burden. When a team repeatedly triggers a DLP alert, they usually aren't trying to be reckless or malicious. They are simply trying to solve a real-world problem that your official, secure process makes impossible to finish on time. If you want to find the rot in your operations, look at where the violations cluster. You might see a sales team constantly trying to email customer lists because the CRM is too slow or doesn't have the specific fields they need to hit their end-of-month targets. They aren't trying to steal the data, they are trying to do their jobs, and the approved method is simply slower than the workaround. We see the same thing in finance when teams move data between blocked systems because the official integration takes 2 weeks and they need the numbers now. Customer service teams often trigger these rules by sharing context with partners because the official support workflow didn't account for how they actually collaborate in the real world. These violations are a loud signal that your official rules are misaligned with how work actually gets done. Most organizations see a violation and immediately try to tighten the screws by adding more blocks and more rules. What they should be doing is asking why the official process is failing the people who are actually trying to generate value for the company. It is very rare that the behavior is purely wrong while the policy is right. More often, the process is structurally broken and needs to be redesigned to match the speed of the business. When you run Purview in audit mode, you get a clear picture of where your friction points live. High concentrations of violations in one department tell you that the organization hasn't designed a workflow that actually works for that specific team's reality. A finance team spending 2 weeks on reconciliation because they have to manually sync 3 different data sources is a DLP violation waiting to happen. A sales team keeping a shadow database because the CRM is a nightmare is another disaster in the making. Looking at these patterns gives you the business intelligence needed to decide where to invest in better systems. You aren't just stopping leaks, you are identifying where the pipes were poorly designed in the first place. Insider risk as organizational stress detection. We need to reframe how we look at insider risk management because these signals are about organizational pressure, not just internal threats. When you see an access spike in finance right before the quarter ends, that isn't a red flag. It's the sound of the engine revving during a normal business cycle. The team is accessing more data because the reconciliation process demands it. The same logic applies to a team exploring new systems during a merger or acquisition. Their behavior changes because the business environment has changed, and the access patterns are simply reflecting that new reality. However, when you see elevated access during a period where a team is severely understaffed, you are looking at a structural stress signal. One person is likely doing the work of three, and they are working odd hours and touching more data just to keep the lights on. Purview might flag this as risky, but the reality is that the person is just exhausted and overextended. Insider risk signals often correlate more closely with burnout and systemic friction than they do with actual malicious intent. A team with high risk scores is usually a team that is being asked to do too much with too little. They are compensating for bad architecture by putting in extra effort, and they are often under immense deadline pressure that forces them to take shortcuts. If you treat this as a security problem, you'll run an investigation and add more friction to an already stressed department. If you treat it as a system outcome, you'll ask what is broken in the workflow and how you can make their jobs easier. One approach treats your people as potential threats to be managed. The other treats your people as sensors that are telling you exactly where your organizational design is failing. Using insider risk as a stress detector allows you to identify burnout before your best people quit. You can catch understaffed teams before they collapse and spot architectural flaws that are forcing people into dangerous shadow systems. The three signals, labels, DLP, and insider risk, are not separate streams of data. They are three different angles on the same reality of how your company operates versus how you think it operates. Label distribution shows you what the organization truly values, while DLP violations show you where the processes are broken. Insider risk signals show you where the pressure is becoming unbearable. Together, they create a diagnostic picture that we can finally translate into real business action. Purview as an X-ray. Now that we have this diagnostic data, the next step is deciding what to do with it. Whether Purview becomes a useless compliance checkbox or a transformative visibility tool depends entirely on your mental approach. You have to stop looking at this data as evidence of being good and start looking at it as evidence of what is. You are treating these patterns as a map of the actual organization, which is almost never the one described in your official documents. The org chart is a theoretical model that shows who reports to whom, but it doesn't show you how work actually moves through the building. Purview data is the model of reality, showing you where information flows, where dependencies live, and where friction is slowing everything down. When you examine access patterns and violation clusters, you are seeing the real organization that lives underneath the one on the PowerPoint slides. And the truth is, those two versions of your company rarely match. Once you start treating Purview as an X-ray, you stop asking if you are compliant and start asking what the data says about your business. Overclassification isn't a failure. It's a sign of deep organizational uncertainty about what is actually valuable. DLP clusters aren't just policy breaks, they are architectural failures where the official system didn't account for the speed of the market. Insider risk concentrations aren't just security threats, they are the heat maps of where your people are most likely to burn out. These are structural signals that tell you how your company is actually built. Seeing the actual organization, not the theoretical one. Your org chart says sales reports to the VP and finance reports to the CFO. It's a clean logical structure that looks great in an annual report. But the Purview data tells the story of the actual decision-making structure. It shows you which teams are truly the pillars of your operations and where information gets trapped, because a specific role has become a bottleneck. If you look at actual access patterns, who is reading, modifying, and sharing what, you might find that a small junior operations team is actually holding up three major workflows. They might be the only ones who understand a legacy system, making them an infrastructure pillar that the org chart completely ignores. You might find a junior analyst who is the sole maintainer of a data source that 5 different departments rely on every single day. The org chart doesn't show that relationship, but the Purview data makes it impossible to miss. In many cases, you'll find that teams are making decisions faster by bypassing formal processes, not to be rebellious, but to keep the business moving. The actual organization is revealed by these data flows and dependencies, not by the lines drawn on a piece of paper. When you see the company this way, silos finally become visible. A silo isn't just a team that won't share. It's a natural boundary that forms when information can't flow easily between groups. You see this most clearly in data duplication, where the same customer list is maintained in 3 different systems by 3 different teams. This isn't a storage problem, it's a coordination failure where teams have given up on the official system because it's too hard to use. Because there is too much friction in getting data from one team to another, people create their own copies. Purview shows you exactly where these shadow copies live and where the versions are starting to diverge. This is the true definition of a silo, an information architecture problem that forces people to work in isolation. Secondly, you start to see the true dependencies that don't follow reporting lines. If a warehouse system goes down, the org chart says the warehouse team is affected, but the data shows that pricing, forecasting, and fulfillment all grind to a halt as well. These aren't failures of the org chart itself, it's just that the chart was never meant to show how data connects your departments. Purview shows those operational relationships, and those are the only ones that matter when something breaks. Finally, this makes architectural inefficiency something you can actually quantify. You can see the manual work that should be automated and the redundant data movement that is eating up your team's time. When a finance team spends 80 hours a month on manual reconciliation, Purview shows you the 3 different sources of truth that are causing the headache. Eliminate that duplication and you don't just improve security, you save thousands of dollars in wasted human effort. Identifying silos through data duplication. Let's look at a concrete example of how you use Purview to find these silos. Imagine a financial firm with 3 different customer databases, one in Salesforce, one in the core banking system, and one in a data warehouse. On the org chart, these are 3 separate divisions that answer to different leaders and have no formal reason to talk to each other. But when you look at the data, you see the exact same customers and overlapping fields across all 3 systems. The Salesforce version has the contact info, the banking system has the transactions, and the warehouse has the behavioral history. Because there is no sync mechanism, a phone number change in Salesforce never makes it to the other 2 systems. Months later, a marketing campaign fails because the analytics team pulled old data from the warehouse. From a leadership perspective, this looks like 3 separate systems, but from a data perspective, it is a massive coordination failure. Purview identifies where this data is stored and how it's being accessed by different teams. The fact that the same data exists in 3 places with different labels and different controls is a structural problem, not a policy one. You don't fix this by writing a new memo about data integrity. You fix it by redesigning the architecture so that information propagates automatically across the entire company. Purview doesn't fix the silo for you, but it makes the cost of that silo visible. It quantifies the redundancy and the consistency gaps that are currently quietly draining your resources, then visualizing true dependencies and critical paths. Purview also reveals that not all critical infrastructure looks important on an org chart. I've seen data teams that are buried deep in IT maintaining ETL processes that move data between systems. On paper, they are a utility function, but the access data shows that the entire company's analytics, reporting, and financial close processes depend entirely on their work. If that small team goes down, the major workflows of the entire company stop. They are a critical path, even if their titles don't reflect it. We see the same thing with junior analysts who maintain unofficial pricing spreadsheets. They aren't managers, but the sales team uses their sheet to quote customers, and finance uses it to forecast the entire year. If that analyst leaves or the spreadsheet breaks, 3 different departments lose their ability to function correctly. The org chart shows a junior employee. The Purview data shows a single point of failure that could derail the quarter. Organizational resilience comes from understanding these hidden dependencies. You need to know where one person or one process failure would cause a massive cascading disruption to the business. Purview's access patterns and lineage data show you which systems are actually critical to which teams. It moves you away from guessing based on titles and toward knowing based on actual operational reality. Exposing operational waste. The final category of insight Purview provides is operational waste. The work that your people are doing that shouldn't have to happen at all. Think about that finance team spending 2 weeks every month just to close the books. They are manually comparing data sources, finding discrepancies, and fixing inconsistencies for hours on end. They are doing this because the customer data, billing data, and ledger data all live in different models with different refresh times. Purview shows you this mess in high definition. 3 different sources of truth that never talk to each other. You can actually put a dollar amount on this. If 4 people are spending 80 hours a month on this, you are burning nearly 1,000 hours a year on a problem that shouldn't exist. At a standard rate, that's over $70,000 a year spent on manual labor that could be solved with better architecture. The problem isn't that the finance team is incompetent, it's that the systems are disconnected. When you fix the architecture and automate that flow, the waste disappears, and the close happens in 2 days instead of 2 weeks. Purview makes this waste visible so you can finally justify the investment to fix the root cause. This is the real power of using Purview as an X-ray. It isn't just about staying out of trouble with regulators, it's about understanding where your money is being wasted and where your processes are too brittle to survive. The org chart is a static dead model. Purview data is a dynamic living one. As we move into an era of AI and autonomous workflows, the dynamic model is the only one that will actually tell you the truth about your business. From risk signals to business intelligence, Now you have the diagnostic picture. You've seen the silos, you've identified the true dependencies, and you've finally quantified the waste. But the real question is, what do you actually do with this information? This is where Purview transforms from a diagnostic tool into an action tool. It's the moment you move from just understanding the problem to actually solving it, and these 3 specific audits will become your roadmap. The classification clarity audit. The first audit is about understanding what your organization actually values. You're going to systematically examine how the organization classifies its data, but I'm not just talking about whether a label exists. You need to look at the distribution, see which teams label consistently, and identify who is falling behind. This labeling behavior is a direct window into your organizational maturity and clarity. Here's how you run this audit. You take the Purview scan data and look at the labeling distribution across the board. You break it down by department, by system, and by the specific person doing the work to see what patterns emerge. For example, you might find the finance department has labeled 85% of its data as highly confidential. Why is that? Is it because finance genuinely handles more sensitive data than everyone else, or is it because they don't actually know what's sensitive and are just erring on the side of caution? Go deeper and look at what they actually marked. Is it every single spreadsheet or just certain types? Are they classifying salary information the same way they classify a simple invoice, and are they treating customer transactions the same as internal ones? When you drill into the specifics, you usually find a lot of inconsistency. You'll see public-facing data labeled highly confidential, while truly sensitive files are marked as basic, which means the classification doesn't reflect actual risk. It reflects organizational anxiety. Now look at sales, where they've only labeled 15% of their data. Most of it is marked as confidential, even though they handle deal info, customer contacts, and pricing. Everything is classified the same way with zero differentiation. This tells a different story because sales isn't anxious, they're just ignoring the process. They've labeled just enough to satisfy a policy requirement without actually thinking about what's inside the files, essentially applying a blanket label so they can move on to the next task. The answer to whether you're labeling correctly is different for every team. Finance needs to learn the difference between what's truly sensitive and what isn't, so they can move toward nuanced classifications. Sales, on the other hand, needs to move from indifference to actual engagement. The classification clarity audit doesn't just tell you if you're compliant, it tells you how mature the organization's thinking is regarding information sensitivity. That answer shapes your entire response. If finance is over-classifying, you might relax controls and help them understand what's actually valuable. But if sales is ignoring the rules, you might need to tighten enforcement until the behavior changes. But you only know which path to take if you run the audit and look at what the data is telling you. Purview also shows you which teams have built muscle around classification through consistent patterns. Consistency is a sign of maturity. And if a team labels the same data the same way every time, they'll adapt quickly when your requirements change. If a team is inconsistent, where the same file type gets 3 different labels from 3 different people, you're looking at a group that hasn't internalized the system. They're treating it as a box to check rather than a decision to make. This is a true organizational diagnostic.
From these patterns, you learn how well different departments understand their own information, which tells you exactly where to invest in education or where to add automation to reduce the guesswork.
The policy reality alignment assessment. The second audit is about the gap between what you're trying to do and what's actually happening on the ground. You likely have a policy stating all customer data must be labeled, and you've probably done the training and set the expectations. Now it's time to measure the gap. Run a scan across your systems and count how much customer data actually has a label. If you find only 30% is covered, that's your policy reality gap, meaning 70% of your customer data is sitting there without the protection you require. This gap is your baseline, and it represents where you actually are, not where you think you are. Now you investigate the 30% that is labeled. Is it clustered in certain systems or tied to specific teams? Is it mostly recent data, or is it only the information that goes through your formal standard processes? Ask the same questions about the 70% that's missing labels. Where is it hiding and which teams are working with it every day? What you're trying to figure out is why the gap exists in the first place. Is it because the policy is too new, or is the labeling process so hard that people are just skipping it? Maybe certain systems don't support labeling at all, or perhaps certain teams don't think the rules apply to them. Each of those answers requires a completely different solution. If the gap exists because the policy is new, it will likely close over time as more data is created, though you might use an automation project to speed things up. If the process is just too difficult, you need to simplify things. Auto-labeling can close these gaps quickly, and pre-populated classifications can reduce the number of decisions a human has to make. If the problem is technical and certain systems don't support labeling, you either need to implement a new tool or find an alternative way to govern that specific data. If a team thinks they're exempt, you need to have a real conversation about why. They might actually be right and the policy isn't relevant to their use case, or they might just need a better explanation of the risks. The policy reality alignment assessment isn't about swinging a hammer. It's about understanding why the gap exists so you can design an intervention that actually fits the problem. Prioritize these gaps by business impact. A gap in a production system where live customer data is processed matters way more than a gap in a test environment or an old archive. Investigate the specific patterns, because a finance team with 0% coverage is a very different problem than one with 90%. 0 means they've opted out entirely, while 90% means they're close and just need a small push to finish. Concentrate your effort where the impact is highest. Don't try to boil the ocean. Solve the high-risk gaps first and use that success to build momentum for the next phase. This is where alignment becomes a business practice. You aren't just asking if you're compliant, you're asking where your governance is actually working and what it will take to move the needle. Organizational behavior pattern analysis. The third audit uses insider risk and access data as a signal for organizational stress. You want to look at when access spikes happen and which teams are showing elevated risk signals. When you correlate these with business events, you can start to see the story the data is trying to tell. A spike in finance access right before the end of the month is perfectly normal. That's just the closing process, and you expect teams to be running reconciliations and accessing more data than usual. A spike during a merger is also normal. Teams are exploring new systems and trying to understand the entity they're integrating, so that exploratory access isn't a risk, it's a requirement. But a spike in the middle of a quiet quarter with no business event to explain it is a real signal. Something has changed. Maybe they're short-staffed, or there's an audit you didn't know about, or perhaps a regulatory deadline is looming. Elevated access spikes often correlate with organizational stress, not malicious intent. Take a customer service team showing high insider risk signals. You might expect them to be flagged because they handle customer data, but look closer at the pattern. If they're accessing files outside of normal hours or looking at accounts they aren't assigned to, you have to ask why. Is this a security risk? It could be, but it's more likely staffing stress. They're short-staffed and working nights just to keep up, taking escalations that aren't theirs because the workload is too high. The signal is real, but how you interpret it changes everything. If you treat it as a security threat, you add friction and tighten controls. But if you treat it as staffing stress, you add headcount or improve the tools so they don't have to work in unusual ways. One interpretation treats the person as a threat, while the other treats the pattern as a symptom of a design problem. To run this audit, you take your insider risk data and map it against business events like quarter ends, budget cycles, or product launches. You ask where the patterns make sense and where they look like anomalies. Patterns that align with the business calendar are just noise, but an access spike with no obvious trigger is a signal you need to follow. Correlate these risk patterns with other metrics like turnover or burnout indicators. You're building a story about where the system is under pressure, which is a massive shift from traditional security analysis. Traditional security asks who is doing something bad, but organizational behavior analysis asks where the system is failing its people. Once you understand the stress, you can fix the root cause. You don't do that by tightening the screws. You do it by adding capacity or redesigning the work itself. These three audits, classification, policy alignment, and behavior analysis, work together to create a full picture of how your company actually operates. This is the diagnostic output you bring to leadership. Nobody is going to invest in governance because of a boring compliance dashboard. They'll invest because they finally see the waste, the friction, and the stress, and they want to fix the business. That's when Purview stops being a checkbox and starts being a business tool. AI readiness and competitive advantage. Here is the one thing nobody tells you about getting ready for AI. The bottleneck isn't the technology, it's the data. And that data constraint is fundamentally a governance problem, not a technical one. You can buy all the Copilot licenses you want and deploy them tomorrow, but if your data is scattered, unclassified, and locked in silos, Copilot will fail. It won't be because the AI is broken, but because the fuel you're feeding it is low quality. This is the big reframe. Governance isn't an obstacle you have to get past to reach AI. It's the foundation that makes AI possible in the first place. Why data clarity is the foundation of AI. When someone asks Copilot a question, there's a lot happening under the hood. If they ask for the customer acquisition cost by region, Copilot has to search through spreadsheets, financial reports, and CRM records to synthesize an answer. But Copilot is only as good as the data it can find. Its success depends on whether that data is discoverable, whether it's actually trustworthy, and whether the AI can even understand what it's looking at. If that acquisition data lives in 17 different places with 17 different definitions of a customer, Copilot will find every single one of them. It will try to mash them together and generate garbage that sounds confident but is completely wrong. We call that a hallucination, but it's actually just a data failure. Without governance, your data is just noise. And Copilot treats noise exactly the same way it treats a signal. It processes it and gives you an output, but that output is only as good as the input. With governance, your data has structure. When customer data is labeled and there's a single version of the truth, Copilot can distinguish the authoritative source from the shadow copies. The difference between AI success and failure isn't the model you use, It's the data foundation you build. When a company gets poor results from Copilot, they usually blame the AI and try to upgrade to a newer model, but they should be looking at their messy data instead. The problem almost always goes back to governance. If the data isn't classified or connected, there's no way for the AI to tell what's important. Here's what clarity actually gives you. When your data is governed and ownership is clear, Copilot understands the context. It respects the boundaries of sensitive data and understands the lineage, so it can actually explain where its answers came from. Even better, you can create AI safe zones. These are collections of data that are properly secured and documented, allowing you to scope Copilot's access so it only learns from the best sources. You might start with finance data because it's clean and ready. Once those teams see reliable insights, you move to sales and repeat the process of classifying and labeling. You do this incrementally, building readiness one domain at a time. Copilot becomes more valuable not because the model got smarter, but because your data got better. Governance is the fuel, quality control for your AI engine. Without it, the engine might run, but it's only going to produce smoke. The 30, 60, 90-day roadmap to AI readiness. Here is how you actually get ready for Copilot in the real world. Days 1 through 30. Visibility and baseline. Your first goal is to see the landscape and understand what you're working with. You need to establish your baseline metrics immediately. Run discovery across your most critical sources, like where your intellectual property and financial records live. Identify the 3 to 5 data types that will actually power your AI, and use Purview to find the gaps in classification or ownership. You're building a picture of your current state so you can document exactly how much of your data is actually protected. When you communicate this to stakeholders, you aren't talking in theories anymore. You can show them exactly what needs to improve before you can safely deploy Copilot at scale. Days 31 through 60, taxonomy and audit. Now it's time to move. You're going to apply governance to those critical data types you identified. Use auto-labeling wherever you can and use manual reviews to validate the results. The goal here isn't perfection, it's consistency. You want a coherent framework rather than a scattered mess. Turn on DLP in audit mode so you can observe patterns without blocking anyone's work yet. This lets you see where policies would trigger and helps you understand friction points before you start enforcement. This is also when you run the 3 audits we talked about. Classification clarity, policy alignment, and behavior patterns. You use these to create a narrative for leadership. You show them where the processes are broken and what needs to be fixed to make the organization AI ready. This story becomes your justification for the entire investment. Days 61 through 90, readiness and enablement. You've seen the landscape and run the audits, so now you build the final foundation. Refine your policies based on what you learned in audit mode. Your DLP rules should only block actual risks, and your labeling should reflect real priorities rather than just anxiety. Create those AI-ready data zones for specific departments like finance or customer service. You aren't locking people out. You're just limiting the scope while you build up your confidence in the system. Make that data easy to find by putting it in the unified catalog and setting up clear access workflows. By day 90, you're AI ready. It's not because you checked every single box, but because you've built a foundation that can actually support AI safely. Cleaning up data entropy. There's a concept that becomes vital when you prepare for AI, and that's data entropy. Entropy is the noise in your system, like duplicate records and conflicting versions of the truth. It's the natural decay that happens when a system is running, but nobody is actively maintaining it. When humans make decisions, entropy doesn't matter as much because a person can look at 2 records and figure out which one is right. But for an AI, entropy is a disaster. It treats every record as equal and can't tell the difference between a current file and an old duplicate, so it processes the noise as if it were a signal. If you've been running for 10 years without a cleanup, you have a lot of entropy. Retention policies are your best tool for managing this. They aren't just for compliance, they're for data quality. Stale data that hasn't been touched in a year is a lie that looks like the truth, and it will lead to bad decisions. Identify that stale data and get it out of your active systems. Whether you delete it or archive it, it needs to be gone. Data lineage is also critical here. You need to know where data came from and if it's still valid. If you can't answer those questions, you can't trust the AI's output. Cleaning up this mess isn't a one-time project. It's a continuous practice that you have to maintain every time you integrate a new source. And this is where Purview's quality tools come in. You can set up automated rules to flag incomplete records or give datasets health scores so you know which ones are actually trustworthy. Aligning permissions with reality. There's a very specific pattern that emerges when you look at access data. Users accumulate permissions over their entire careers. They move to new roles but keep their old access, or contractors stay longer than expected and keep keys they should have returned. We call this permission creep, and it's usually invisible until you turn on Copilot. Copilot respects your existing permissions, so if you have access to something, the AI can see it. If you've inherited access to systems you don't even use anymore, Copilot is going to surface that data. This isn't a security failure, it's a visibility failure. You just weren't looking. Aligning permissions isn't about being restrictive, it's about being clear. People should have exactly what they need to do their jobs, nothing more and nothing less. Use Purview's access reviews to ask the hard questions. Does this person still need this level of access, and is it proportional to their current role? The data will tell the story through access patterns and role changes. You'll see exactly where the permissions have drifted away from reality. Fix the alignment iteratively. You don't have to revoke everything at once, but you do need to remove what isn't needed and document what's left. This clean foundation is what Copilot operates against, the decision accelerator effect. When you do this work correctly, something interesting happens. Organizations with governed data actually move faster than those without it. It's not because governance adds speed, but because it removes the friction that slows everyone down. When you have a single source of truth and clear ownership, decision-making becomes instant. You don't have to waste time validating data or arguing about which spreadsheet is the real one. Finance can close the books in 2 days instead of 2 weeks because the data flows automatically. Sales can forecast accurately because their pipeline is clean, and operations can respond to issues in real time. This is where governance becomes a true competitive advantage. Companies with governed data deploy AI faster because their foundation is solid. They get reliable results because their inputs are trustworthy, and they can scale without being afraid of what Copilot might accidentally surface. The advantage always goes to the organization with the clearest view of its own operations. That clarity comes from Purview and from running these audits to see the business as it actually is. You don't build governance because an auditor told you to. You build it because it's the only way to move fast in 2026. Purview isn't a compliance tool, it's the lens you use to see your company clearly. And in a world where speed and AI determine the winners, that clarity is everything. Strategic synthesis and action. Purview as the bridge between IT and the boardroom. In most organizations, the conversation around Microsoft Purview follows a very predictable, very broken script. It usually starts by saying they need Purview because it's a compliance requirement, which immediately prompts the CFO to ask about the total cost. When IT lists off licensing, implementation, and management fees, the CFO naturally asks what the actual business value is. This is where IT usually hits a wall because they've framed the entire project as a cost center, a checkbox, or just another boring compliance tool. That conversation almost always ends with a tiny budget, a grudging approval, and an investment that is destined to fail. We need to change the script to reflect how technology actually shapes business reality. The right conversation starts with business strategy, announcing a plan to deploy AI and build autonomous workflows that require moving fast without breaking things. I can then explain that the current data foundation is scattered and unclassified, meaning they can't safely deploy AI at scale without better visibility. When the business asks what is needed to get that visibility, the answer is Purview, not for the sake of compliance, but because it's the only way to see if the organization is actually ready for AI. This shift in framing changes everything because business leaders don't actually care about the tool itself. They care about revenue, risk, and competitive advantage. Purview only matters to the boardroom if it translates into the outcomes they are already chasing, like whether they can move fast without exposing sensitive trade secrets. It has to build a bridge from "we need this for the auditors" to "this tool shows us if we can actually execute our strategy." This bridge is built on the audits you've already done, the quantified waste you've found, and the silos you've identified. When you bring this data to the board, you aren't asking for a Purview budget anymore. You are asking for an AI readiness and data governance budget. You are asking for the resources to fix the structural problems that are currently blocking your company's most important goals. The data makes your request concrete, so instead of saying governance is important, you can point to the $72,000 lost every year to manual reconciliation. You can tell them that Copilot cannot be safely deployed until you know where the sensitive data lives, and that discovery process requires a specific timeline and cost. This is the ultimate reframe, where Purview becomes the diagnostic tool that justifies the organizational transformation you need to win it. The executive narrative. The old way of talking about data is defensive and reactive, which positions governance as a heavy overhead that everyone wants to avoid. You've heard it before. We need this because the regulators are getting stricter and we need to avoid massive fines. While that might be true, it's a weak narrative that only justifies the bare minimum investment and never captures the attention of the CEO. It treats the system as a burden rather than an asset. The new narrative is strategic because it positions governance as a high-performance enabler for the entire company. Instead of talking about rules, you tell the board you deployed Purview to understand how the business actually operates, and then you show them the results. You might show them that 2 weeks of every month are wasted on data reconciliation because 3 different systems aren't talking to each other. By quantifying that cost at $72,000 a year, you turn a technical problem into a clear savings opportunity that any executive will want to fund. You can point out that the sales team is using a shadow system in Excel because the CRM is too slow, which is why your deal forecasting is so inaccurate. You can show that while finance and HR have mature data systems, the operations and customer service teams are fragmented and need a better template to follow. This narrative is about efficiency and readiness, and it uses Purview to reveal the hidden friction that is slowing everyone down. If you find that permission creep has given people access to files they shouldn't see, you can explain that Copilot will expose that data the moment it's turned on. You can even show where the organization is under the most stress by correlating high-risk signals with understaffed departments and broken processes. Every one of these statements is grounded in hard data, showing exactly what Purview revealed that you didn't know just a few months ago. This is the narrative that gets real investment because it solves actual business problems rather than just satisfying a legal requirement. The 90-day pilot plan. You don't execute a shift like this in theory. You do it in practice over a 90-day sprint. Phase 1. Audit and discover. Days 1 to 30. Start by identifying the 3 most critical data types for your specific business, whether that is customer data, financial records, or your intellectual property. You need to run discovery scans across Microsoft 365 Azure and your on-premises systems to see where that data actually lives and who has access to it. This gives you a baseline so you can see the gap between your official policies and the messy reality of how people are working. Once you have that, you create a data reality check for leadership that outlines exactly what needs to happen before Copilot can be safely switched on. Phase 2. Automate and observe, days 31 to 60. Once you have the baseline, start applying auto-labeling to those critical data types and use manual reviews to make sure the system is working. You aren't looking for perfection here, you are looking for consistency across the system. Turn on data loss prevention in audit mode so you can observe patterns and document where violations would happen without actually blocking anyone's work yet. This allows you to translate your findings into business language, identifying where the friction is and highlighting the stress points in your current workflows. Phase 3. Build control plane, days 61 to 90. In the final month, you refine your policies based on what you actually learned during the audit phase, so they reflect reality instead of just good intentions. You create AI-ready data zones by securing and documenting the most important collections of data, starting small with finance or product teams. By establishing easy access request workflows and clear ownership, you make it simple for people to find what they need while maintaining total security. By day 90, you are ready to move forward because you've built a foundation that can support AI safely and sustainably. This isn't a one-time project, but a permanent shift toward ongoing monitoring and refinement that keeps your data foundation solid as you scale. Connecting data clarity to competitive advantage. The organizations that can see themselves clearly have a massive advantage over the ones operating in the dark. When you understand your real constraints, the silos that slow down decisions, and the manual processes holding things together, you can make choices based on reality instead of assumptions. These companies deploy AI faster because their data foundation is trustworthy, and they reduce their overall risk because they know exactly what they are protecting. They don't just move faster, they move with a level of confidence that their competitors simply cannot match. Think about 2 different companies. Organization A operates on a gut feeling that their data is fine, while Organization B operates on observed reality. Organization A thinks their processes are working and their teams are aligned, but they are usually wrong, and that overconfidence eventually leads to a crisis. When Organization A tries to roll out Copilot, they suddenly realize their permissions are a mess and their data is scattered everywhere, forcing them to stop everything for 6 months to fix it. Organization B has already done that work, so they move methodically, hitting their targets months ahead of everyone else. The same thing happens with automation. Organization A tries to automate a workflow only to find out it's a non-linear mess that depends on one person's undocumented knowledge. Because Organization B has already mapped their actual workflows and documented the dependencies, their automation works the first time. This isn't about governance for the sake of having rules. It's about building a system that allows you to win. The winners in 2026 won't be the ones with the most data, but the ones who actually understand the data they have and where the risks are hiding. Purview is the tool that makes this vision possible by letting you see the actual organization operating underneath the official org chart. In an era where speed and AI determine the winners, seeing your organization clearly isn't just a nice feature, it's a matter of survival. The strategic imperative. By now, you should understand that Purview is not just a compliance solution. You can treat it like a checkbox if you want, but if you do, you are leaving almost all of the actual value on the table. Purview is a diagnostic platform that shows you how your business really operates, revealing the gap between your assumptions and the reality where risk and opportunity live. The organizations that win over the next few years will be the ones that close that gap by identifying silos and quantifying waste. They use these tools not because they have to, but because they want the clarity required to lead their industry. The 30 to 60-90 roadmap I've shared is your starting point. And the data reality check is your primary diagnostic tool. Run the audits, build the narrative, and then you can deploy Copilot with the kind of confidence that only comes from a solid foundation. If you want to discuss your specific governance challenges, connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to the M365 FM podcast for more deep dives into the intersection of strategy, data, and AI. If you found this perspective helpful, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so others can find it too. Your next big competitive advantage is seeing your organization for what it actually is, and everything else you want to achieve follows from that one truth. My name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. By now, you understand the mechanics of the system, but we need to talk about what actually changes because of it. You can treat Purview as a simple compliance solution if you want to. It's easy to use it that way, to tick a box, run a few reports, and show your auditors that you have some controls in place before moving on with your day. But if that's all you do, you are leaving the real value on the table. Purview is actually a diagnostic platform. It functions as the operating system for understanding how your business really operates in the wild. This isn't about how you think things work or what the official org chart says. It's about seeing the truth in real time, backed by hard data, and moving away from guesswork. The gap between your assumptions and reality, the space between the theoretical organization and the actual one, is exactly where risk lives. That same gap is also where your best opportunities hide. If we're being honest, most organizations are currently wasting significant money on processes that shouldn't exist and manual work that should have been automated years ago. Most leadership teams have never actually measured this gap because they have never looked at the data and asked the hard questions. They don't know what they don't know, so they continue to operate in a state of confident ignorance. This brings us back to the illusion of control we discussed at the beginning of this conversation. You have your policies, your processes, and your training frameworks, so you naturally assume the system is working as intended. You assume your data is protected and your teams are aligned, but that assumption is almost always wrong. Here is what happens when you stop assuming and actually start measuring. You might discover that 85% of your data is overclassified because the people inside the system don't actually know what counts as sensitive. You'll see that policies exist on paper, but nobody follows them because they don't match how work actually gets done. These discoveries show that critical workflows often depend on specific people rather than resilient systems, creating undocumented single points of failure. You will likely find that you're wasting a lot of money on reconciliation and manual data movement. This friction is created by systems that don't talk to each other, forcing your people to work around broken processes instead of fixing the root cause. This discovery is usually uncomfortable. It challenges the narrative you've been telling yourself about your organization and suggests that leadership knows much less than they thought. It means there is real work to be done, but this matters more now than ever as we move through 2026. You are likely deploying AI or building autonomous workflows right now. You're planning to give digital systems access to your data and trusting them to operate safely. You are betting your entire competitive advantage on moving fast with AI while trying to maintain some level of control. But here's the thing. You cannot do this without seeing your organization clearly. Copilot is designed to respect your permissions, your sensitivity labels, and your data governance. However, Copilot only works effectively if your governance is actually real and your permissions are aligned with actual roles. If you haven't done the foundational work and you're still operating on assumptions, the AI will expose those flaws immediately. It will surface data that should have stayed hidden and give confidential information to people who were never supposed to see it. This is not a theoretical risk for the future. In 2026, many organizations have already paused their Copilot rollouts because they realized they didn't actually know where their sensitive data was located. They started the deployment, the system started oversharing information, and they had to stop everything to clean up the foundation. That is a 6-month delay in a market where speed is your only real competitive advantage. The organizations that win this year won't be the ones with perfect, flawless data. Those companies probably don't even exist. The winners will be the ones that see themselves clearly and understand exactly where their silos and dependencies are. They have identified the stress points, quantified the waste, and made intentional decisions about what needs to change. These leaders know what they are protecting and whether that protection is actually working. They can move fast with AI because they've built a structural foundation that actually supports it. Now, let's talk about what this requires from you. This isn't just about running a piece of software like Purview. It's about a total organizational transformation. The foundation work is significant and requires you to scan your data, classify it, and document who actually owns it. You have to build access control frameworks and retention policies while establishing constant monitoring. This takes time, resources, and a level of discipline that most companies struggle to maintain. You will also run into resistance because the status quo technically works for now. Work gets done, money flows, and the organization survives another day. But that status quo is incredibly fragile because it depends on people knowing things that aren't documented and systems being held together by manual effort. This fragility becomes a critical failure point when you try to scale or automate your business. Scale always exposes weakness, and automation requires you to document things that used to be implicit. Governance forces you to look at that fragility, which is exactly why so many organizations resist it. It's not because governance is bad, but because it makes invisible problems visible. Once a problem is visible, you are forced to fix it. But you have to fix these issues anyway, because the invisible problems are already costing you a fortune. The only real question is whether you'll fix them intentionally as part of a plan or wait until something breaks and you're forced to react. Think about a finance team spending 2 weeks every month on reconciliation that shouldn't have to happen. That is a hidden cost that is happening right now, even if you aren't calling it that. When a sales team maintains a shadow CRM because the official one is too slow, you are paying for redundant systems and wasted effort. When teams fight over data access because ownership is unclear, you pay for that in miscommunication and delays. If you choose to govern intentionally, you expose these costs and fix them once and for all. If you don't, you will simply pay those costs forever. This is what governance actually buys you. It's not about auditor approval or simple compliance. It's about cost reduction and faster decision-making. It's about better data quality and a faster path to AI deployment. This is the narrative that actually gets investment from the board. Don't tell them you need to be compliant. Tell them you're wasting $72,000 a year on a process that shouldn't exist and you have a plan to fix it. That gets a yes. Tell them you can deploy Copilot faster and with more confidence if you have a clear picture of your data landscape. Show them the investment, the timeline, and exactly what the business gains. That is how you get the resources you need. Most companies are underutilizing their data because it's scattered and nobody knows what's available. If you centralize and govern that data, you unlock insights that drive better decisions. That is a real business case. This is where the 30-60-90 roadmap becomes relevant. It isn't a compliance checklist. It's a transformation roadmap designed to move you from assumption-based operating to reality-based operating. In phase 1, you focus on seeing the landscape by running scans and establishing your baselines. This is where you create the narrative. In phase 2, you build the initial governance by classifying critical data and observing where your processes actually break. This is where you create the executive story. By phase 3, you are establishing control and preparing for AI by creating AI-ready zones and access frameworks. By the end of 90 days, you won't be perfectly governed, but you will be intentionally governed. You'll have the visibility and the roadmap you need to deploy Copilot with total confidence. In the organizations that do this work, the results are obvious. They move faster because they have intentional governance, not because they have less of it. They make decisions quickly because they aren't fighting over conflicting data sources. These companies reduce costs by eliminating redundant work and retiring broken systems. They reduce risk through intentional protection because they actually know what they are guarding and who has access to it. They can scale AI safely because their foundation is clean and their permissions are aligned. They even attract better talent because the organization is legible and people understand why decisions are being made. Work doesn't require constant workarounds, which leads to less frustration and higher retention. This is your true return on investment. It's not just a financial metric, it's an organizational one that determines how competitive and sustainable your business will be. You might be thinking, this sounds great in theory, but you're wondering how to actually get started tomorrow morning. You likely already have Purview licenses that you haven't fully activated yet. You might be using it for basic reporting, but you aren't using it as the diagnostic tool it was meant to be. Start by picking one critical data type, like your customer data or your intellectual property. Run a scan and see where it lives, how it's classified, and who has access to it. Give yourself 2 weeks for this. Then, run the audits to check for policy-reality alignment and observe the behavior patterns of your organization. Take another 2 weeks for that. Once you have the data, create a 10-slide deck that tells the story of what you found. Take that deck to your leadership team. Don't ask for a software budget. Ask for a data governance budget to fix the specific gaps the data revealed. That is how this becomes real. From there, you build incrementally, phase by phase, and domain by domain. Eventually, the organization becomes transparent and intentional. This is not a technical transformation. It is an architectural shift from operating on hope to operating on observation. In 2026, when your competitive advantage depends on AI and speed, this shift is existential. So here's what I want you to do next. Connect with me, Mirko Peters, on LinkedIn and share your governance challenges. The M365 FM podcast is a community of people thinking deeply about these exact questions. Subscribe to the podcast because this episode is just the beginning. We have a full catalog of deep dives on governance, fabric, and Copilot that show you how to transform your organization from the inside out. If this reframing of Purview as a business intelligence tool resonates with you, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Help other leaders see Purview as a lens for their business rather than just a checkbox for their auditors. Start the work today. Start with one scan and one narrative to see what the data tells you about your organization. Your next competitive advantage isn't a new piece of technology or a fancy new process. Your next advantage is seeing your organization clearly for the first time. Everything else, from cost reduction to AI speed, follows from that visibility. Purview is the tool that makes that vision possible, so use it as the diagnostic tool that shows you who you really are. Thanks for listening to this episode of the M365 FM podcast. I'm Mirko Peters, and I'll see you next time.